Ma, I'm hungry. The boy's voice was a small, dry thing, swallowed by the vast, heat-blasted silence of the Arizona Territory. His mother, Sarah Wilkins, didn't turn from the cabin door. She just stared out at the cracked earth of her homestead, a place that had swallowed her husband 6 months ago and was now coming for her son. "I know, Thomas," she said, the words sticking in her throat like dust. "Soon." But soon was a lie. The crops were withered skeletons. The last of the flour was a pale film at the bottom of the sack. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. Every night, the coyotes sang their song of starvation, a reminder that in this land, everything was either predator or prey. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, which one they were. That's when she saw it. A shape on the horizon. A rider, moving slowly through the shimmering heat. Visitors were rare. Welcome visitors were rarer still. "Thomas, get inside," she ordered, her voice low and tight. Her hand went to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, the cold weight of the stock a familiar grim comfort. The figure drew closer. An Apache man. Tall and weathered, he sat on his horse with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the brutal landscape. But it was the thing strapped to his chest that made Sarah's breath catch. A cradleboard. And in it, a baby. The man stopped his horse 20 feet from her, his hand raised in a sign of peace. "I mean no harm," he said, his English clear, but accented. "My name is Nakohi. I seek help." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. In this land, a man seeking help could be the most dangerous thing of all. "What kind of help?" Sarah's voice was a low warning. The rifle was steady in her hands, pointed not at the man, but at the ground between them. A line drawn in the dirt. Nakohi gestured to the infant on his chest. The baby was still, its tiny face pinched and pale. "My daughter. Her mother died in childbirth. 3 days ago. She needs milk." The words hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. A man's grief. A child's hunger. It was a story she knew all too well. "I have no milk," she said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. "My son is 8 years old." "I understand," Nakohi said, his gaze sweeping over her failing crops, her son's thin frame visible in the dark doorway behind her. "Perhaps you know of someone who can help. I can trade. I am a hunter." The word hunter snagged on Sarah's desperation. Meat. It had been weeks. "We have little food to spare," she said, testing him. "I do not ask for food," he replied. "I provide it. In the settlement, 10 miles south. There is a woman who just had a child. She could feed my daughter. I will hunt for you. I will teach your boy to hunt, in return for your help." The offer was a lifeline thrown into a churning sea of despair. Martha Reynolds. She had just given birth. The trade was more than fair. It was a miracle. But miracles in this land often had a price, paid in blood. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, the question a shield against a hope she was terrified to feel. Nakohi's face was a mask of stone. "You don't. But my daughter will die. And from the look of your land, winter will not be kind to you and your son." He was right. It was a truth as stark and unforgiving as the desert sun. "Ma." Thomas's voice came again from the doorway, a quiet plea. "I'm still hungry." Sarah looked at her son's hollow eyes, then back at the Apache man and the silent, starving infant. It was an impossible choice. Trusting a stranger could get them killed. Refusing him was a slower but no less certain death sentence. "We can leave at first light," she said, lowering the rifle completely. "It's too hot to travel now." A flicker of relief crossed Nakohi's face. "Thank you." He dismounted, moving with a careful grace. "To show good faith, I will find us food for tonight." He gently unstrapped the cradleboard. "May I leave her with you while I hunt?" The shade. Another impossible choice. To take this strange child into her home. To be responsible for its fragile life. She hesitated, then gave a sharp, single nod. "Her name is Ayana," Nakohi said, his voice softening for the first time. It means eternal bloom. As he handed the cradle board to Sarah, their fingers brushed. In that fleeting contact, an unspoken truth passed between them. They were two parents from two different worlds, standing on the same ledge of grief and desperation. He took his bow and disappeared into the scrubland, a ghost in the shimmering heat. Sarah carried the tiny, silent baby into the cool darkness of the cabin. Thomas crept closer, his eyes wide. "She's so small, Ma." "Yes," Sarah whispered, looking down at the infant's face. "And she's very hungry, just like us." As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, Sarah saw Nakohi returning. A fat jackrabbit was slung over his shoulder, and for the first time in 6 long months, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something other than fear. She didn't know then that the hope he carried was far more dangerous than the hunger he had come to fix. The journey to the Reynolds homestead was a silent, tense affair. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound a potential ambush. Sarah rode the old mule, Thomas behind her, while Nakohi led on his horse, Ayanna a still precious bundle on his chest. They spoke only once. "Your husband?" Nakohi asked, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Influenza," Sarah replied. "Last winter." He nodded. "My wife." The birth. Grief was a language they both understood. It needed no further translation. They saw the Reynolds place around midday, a larger, more prosperous homestead nestled in a shallow valley. A man, William Reynolds, came out of the barn, his face hard, a rifle in his hands. His hostility was a wall Sarah had to break through. She explained the situation quickly, her words tumbling out. William's face grew colder with every sentence. "You want my Martha to nurse an Apache baby?" He scoffed, his knuckles white on his rifle. "I can pay," Nakohi said, his voice even, his dignity a shield against the man's scorn. "I can provide meat for your family." "We don't need your charity," William snarled. Just then, the cabin door opened. Martha Reynolds stood there, a plump, kind-faced woman with her own infant on her hip. She took in the scene, her eyes moving from her husband's angry face to Sarah's desperate one, and finally to the tiny, still form of Ayanna. "William Reynolds, you put that gun down," she said, her voice quiet, but laced with steel. She walked right past him, her eyes fixed on Ayanna. "Bring her inside," she said to Nakohi. "No child starves on my watch. I don't care who her people are." Inside, a deal was struck. A fragile truce born of one woman's compassion and another's desperation. Martha would nurse Ayanna for 2 weeks. In return, Nakohi would hunt for both families. He would stay in the barn. William watched the entire exchange with a sullen, simmering anger. Later, as Ayanna fed for the first time in days, a quiet, contented sound in the warm kitchen, Sarah saw William step outside. He didn't go back to the barn. He walked to the edge of his property and stared east, toward the town. His posture was rigid, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid. But what could a man with a prosperous homestead, a healthy wife and child, possibly be afraid of? That night, as Sarah and Thomas prepared to ride back to their own cabin, she found Nakohi outside the Reynolds barn, carving a piece of wood by moonlight. "Leaving her here," Sarah said, more a statement than a question. "You're certain?" He nodded, not looking up from his work. "It is necessary. She will live." "You trust them?" Sarah pressed. "You trust him?" She nodded toward the house, toward the man who had looked at him with such hatred. Nakohi's hands stilled. He finally looked up at her, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. "I trusted you." The words should have been a comfort, but the image of William Reynolds staring out at the empty road, his face a mask of fear, had planted a seed of unease in Sarah's heart. This wasn't just a simple arrangement. There was something else at play here, a current of tension running beneath the surface that she couldn't understand. And she had the terrible feeling that by bringing Nakohi here, she hadn't just found a solution, she had stepped into a trap. The 2 weeks passed in a strange, new rhythm. Each morning, Nakohi would appear at their homestead, a silent figure emerging from the dawn. He would take Thomas out into the desert, teaching him the secrets of the land, the language of the hunt. Sarah watched as her son transformed. The hollow look in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused gleam. He learned to move like a shadow, to read the stories left in the dust. He was becoming a part of the land, not just a victim of it. In the afternoons, Sarah would ride with Nakohi to the Reynolds place. While he spent a precious hour with his daughter, Sarah would sit with Martha, a quiet bond of motherhood forming between them. Ayana was thriving, her cheeks filling out, her cries growing stronger. But the unease Sarah felt on that first day never truly left. William Reynolds remained distant, his politeness a thin veneer over a deep-seated hostility. He would watch Nakohi with a hawk-like intensity, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. And Sarah noticed other things, strange things. A rider would sometimes visit the Reynolds homestead late at night, a dark shape meeting with William in the shadow of the barn. Their conversations were low, urgent whispers, always ending with the quiet exchange of a small, heavy pouch. Martha, when asked, would simply shake her head, her eyes clouded with a worry she refused to name. "William has business," was all she would say. "It's best not to ask." The questions festered in Sarah's mind. What kind of business was conducted in the dead of night? What was in those pouches? The answer came on the last day of the second week. Sarah and Nakohi arrived at the Reynolds place to find a strange horse tied to the fence. It was a fine black stallion, its saddle richly tooled. It was the horse of a wealthy man. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Martha was pale, her hands twisting in her apron. William stood by the fireplace, his face slick with sweat, and sitting at their table, as if he owned the place, was a man in a tailored suit. He was handsome, with a cold, cruel smile, and eyes like chips of ice. "Ah, the noble savage," the man said, his voice smooth as silk as Nakohi entered. He looked Nakohi up and down with an air of amused contempt. "And the little widow. How convenient. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you both down." "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for Thomas, who was watching from the doorway. The man's smile widened. "My name is Silas Kane. This land, this entire valley belongs to me, and Mr. Reynolds here has been remiss in his payments." He gestured to William, who flinched as if struck. "The silver mine he works," Kane continued, "is on my property. We had an arrangement, a percentage of his findings. But the mine has run dry, and now Mr. Reynolds is in my debt." It all clicked into place. The late-night visits, the heavy pouches. William wasn't just a rancher. He was a prospector, and he was in debt to a very powerful, very dangerous man. Kane turned his icy gaze back to Nakohi. "But as it happens, a new opportunity has presented itself. There are renegades in the mountains. My men have been tracking them. The cavalry is offering a handsome bounty for any information leading to their capture." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You, my friend, are that information. A peaceable Apache, with a child, moving freely between the settlements. You can get close to them. You can tell me where they are." "And if I refuse?" Nakohi asked, his voice a low growl. Kane's smile vanished. "Then I will take my payment from Mr. Reynolds in other ways." His gaze flickered to Martha, then to her infant son sleeping in his cradle. The threat was unspoken, but it hung in the air like a hangman's noose. But there was more. Kane's eyes settled on Ayana, who was in Martha's arms. "And I will take the child. The cavalry is always interested in foundlings. They can be re-educated, civilized. He was a monster. He would use a child as a pawn in his cruel game." Suddenly, William Reynolds, who had been standing silent and shamed, seemed to find a spine. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You will not. This has gone far enough." Kane just laughed. "A little late for a conscience, isn't it, William?" But Nakohi had heard enough. He took a single silent step forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. The promise of violence in his stillness was more terrifying than any blade. "You will not touch my daughter," he said, his voice quiet, but with an edge that could cut stone. Kane's men, who had been standing outside, burst into the room, their guns drawn. The cabin, once a place of fragile hope, had become a powder keg, and Silas Kane had just lit the fuse. The standoff was broken by a sudden frantic shout from outside. "Riders coming! Cavalry patrol!" Kane's face contorted in a snarl of fury. The one thing he couldn't control had just arrived at his doorstep. He shot a look of pure hatred at Nakohi. This isn't over. He and his men were out the door in a flash, disappearing into the scrubland just as the blue-coated soldiers crested the ridge. The cavalry patrol was led by a young, weary-looking lieutenant. He listened to William's stammered, edited version of events, a simple visit from a neighboring homesteader, his eyes lingering on Nakohi with suspicion. "We're hunting the renegades who raided the Circle K supply wagon last week," the lieutenant said, his eyes scanning the faces in the room. Silas Kane's wagon. "Seen any strangers in these parts? Apaches?" "No one," William said, his lie smooth enough to pass. The lieutenant didn't look convinced, but he had no reason to press the matter. He gave a curt nod. "Keep your eyes open. These are dangerous men." He turned to Nakohi. "And you. It's not safe for your kind to be out here alone. You should be on the reservation." "My people had nothing to do with any raid," Nakohi said, his voice flat. "That's what they all say," the lieutenant said, his gaze cold. He gave a final warning to William about harboring fugitives, then led his patrol away. The moment they were gone, the fragile truce in the room shattered. "You have to go," William said to Nakohi, his voice trembling with a fear that was now laced with anger. "You brought this trouble to my door. Kane will be back, and he won't be in a talking mood." "He threatened your family, William," Martha cried. "This isn't Nakohi's fault." "He is the reason Kane was here," William retorted. "He needs to take his child and go. Now, before he gets us all killed." Nakohi's face was grim. He knew William was right. His presence put everyone in danger. He walked over to Martha and gently took Ayana from her arms. "Thank you," he said to her, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "You saved her life." He turned to Sarah. "I must go. Warn my people." "We'll come with you," Sarah said, the words out before she could think. "No." Nakohi's refusal was absolute. "It is too dangerous. If the cavalry finds you with us, they will assume you are captives." "So we'll never see you again?" The question was from Thomas, but it echoed the fear in Sarah's own heart. Nakohi looked at the boy, then at Sarah. He saw the trust in their eyes, the bond that had been forged between them, and he made a decision. A dangerous, desperate decision. "There is a place," he said. "A hidden valley, 3 days' ride north. My people go there to be safe from the soldiers' eyes. It has water, game, a place to hide." He paused, his gaze intense. "If you were to be there, 1 month from today, perhaps the lessons could continue." It was a thread of hope, thin and fragile, but it was all they had. He gave Thomas a leather cord from around his own neck, a stone amulet that had belonged to his father. "To remind you of what you have learned," he said. To Sarah he gave a small pouch of herbs. "For fever," he said, his eyes meeting hers. A silent message passed between them. A promise of more than just a cure for sickness. The farewell was swift. He mounted his horse, Ayana secure against his chest, and rode out, not looking back. Sarah watched him go, a cold dread mixing with the flicker of hope. William Reynolds was right. Silas Kane would be back. And this time, he wouldn't be looking to make a deal. He would be looking for revenge. She looked around at her failing homestead. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. That night, as Thomas slept, clutching the amulet, Sarah made her choice. They couldn't stay. But she wouldn't run in fear. They would go to the valley, not just to wait for Nakohi, but to prepare, to make a stand. She had been a victim for too long. Now she would become a hunter. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to learn. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving teacher, but Sarah and Thomas were determined students. They abandoned the homestead, the ghost of a failed dream, and journeyed north, their few possessions loaded onto their old mule. They found the valley just as Nakohi had described it, a hidden slash of green in the brown, desolate landscape. It was a sanctuary, a place to heal, to prepare. Days bled into weeks. Thomas practiced with his bow until his fingers were raw, his aim becoming deadly accurate. Sarah, using the knowledge Nakohi had shared, learned the secrets of the valley. She identified medicinal herbs, found hidden springs, mapped the game trails. She was no longer just surviving. She was adapting. She was becoming a part of this wild land, her grief and fear slowly being replaced by a fierce, quiet resolve. They spoke of Nakohi and Ayana often, their absence a constant presence. Thomas never lost faith. "He'll come, Ma," he would say every morning, his hand on the stone amulet. He promised. Sarah was less certain. A month was a long time in a world where a life could be extinguished in an instant. On the morning of the 30th day, Thomas was up before dawn, perched on the ridge overlooking the single trail into the valley. Sarah watched him, her heart a tight knot of hope and fear. The sun was high in the sky when she heard his shout. She looked up, shading her eyes. 3 riders, an old man with long gray braids, a young woman, and in the lead, a familiar, straight-backed figure. Nakohi. He had come. He was not alone. The elder, Takakota, and the young woman, Hawkeye, his cousin, had come as a sign of their people's gratitude. They brought gifts, warm blankets, cured meats, and a promise. "Our council has spoken," Nakohi translated for the elder. "Those who save a child of the people become family to the people. You may stay in this valley. You will be safe here. We will protect you." Family. The word settled over Sarah like a warm blanket, but the safety they offered was fragile. Nakohi brought news. Silas Kane was on the warpath. He had put a bounty on Nakohi's head, claiming he was the leader of the renegades. The cavalry, fueled by Kane's lies and money, was sweeping the mountains. "He is not just looking for me," Nakohi said, his face grim. "He is using this as an excuse to drive my people from their lands, the lands where he wants to expand his silver mines." The pieces were falling into a dark, ugly picture. The raid had been a pretext. Kane was manufacturing a war to satisfy his own greed. But there was a twist Nakohi hadn't shared before. "The men who raided Kane's wagon," he said, his voice low. "They were not my people. They were from a rival band, the Chokonen. Their leader, a man named Diablo, is a true renegade. He hates all white men, and he hates my people for our attempts to keep the peace." They were caught in a vice. On one side, Kane and the cavalry. On the other, a ruthless Apache war chief who saw them all as enemies. "Diablo's band was last seen moving toward this region," Takakota added, his old eyes troubled. "He is drawn to conflict like a moth to a flame." The sanctuary was no longer safe. It was about to become a battleground. A few days later, a scout from Nakohi's village arrived, his horse lathered, his face streaked with sweat and dust. His news was dire. "Diablo's warriors have been spotted 2 ridges over," the scout reported. "They are moving fast, and they are not alone. They have joined with Kane's men." Sarah stared in disbelief. "They're working together?" "It is an unholy alliance," Nakohi said, his voice tight with fury. "Kane has promised Diablo guns and whiskey in exchange for helping him hunt us down. He uses one Apache to kill another. It was a strategy as old as the wars themselves. Divide and conquer." "They will come here," Takakota said, his voice a low rumble. "This valley is a sacred place. Diablo would love nothing more than to defile it." They had to make a choice: flee and be hunted down in the open, or stay and fight for their lives in the valley that had become their home. "We stay," Sarah said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. She looked at Thomas, who stood beside her, his small bow clutched in his hand. "We do not run anymore." Nakohi looked at her, a glimmer of admiration in his dark eyes. He turned to his people. "We stay," he said. "We will make our stand here." The valley became a fortress. Under Nakohi's direction, they prepared for a siege. They fortified the narrow entrance with deadfall traps. They set snares along the game trails. They found high ground, creating hidden positions for archers. Sarah worked alongside them, her hands growing calloused, her muscles aching. She was no longer a widow waiting for a savior. She was a warrior, fighting for her family. Her real family. Thomas, too, found his place. His small size allowed him to move through the underbrush like a whisper. He became their scout, their eyes and ears, his warnings giving them precious time to prepare. The evening before the attack, Nakohi found Sarah sharpening arrowheads by the fire. The entire valley was quiet, a held breath before a storm. "You are not afraid," he said, a statement, not a question. "I'm terrified," she admitted, not looking up from her work. "But I'm more afraid of what I was before. A woman waiting to die. Here. Here I feel alive." He sat beside her. He took a small, intricately carved wooden bird from a pouch at his belt. It was the one he had been carving the first night she'd met him at the Reynolds barn. "For Ayanna," he said, handing it to her. "If I do not survive tomorrow, I want you to have it, to remember." "You will survive," she said, her voice fierce. She took the bird, its smooth wood warm against her palm. "If we survive," he said, his voice low, "there is something I must ask you." Before he could continue, a low whistle came from the ridge above. The signal from Thomas. They were here. The attack came at dawn, a wave of shrieking warriors and hard-faced gunmen pouring into the narrow mouth of the valley. Cain's men had the rifles, but Diablo's warriors had the numbers and a chilling, bloodthirsty courage. The first wave hit the deadfall traps, their charge breaking into chaos as men and horses were crushed under tons of falling rock and timber. From the cliffs above, Nakohi's archers rained down a silent, deadly shower of arrows. Sarah was with the women and children, deeper in the valley, but she was not idle. She had organized a supply line, ensuring fresh arrows and water got to the fighters. She tended to the wounded, her hands, once soft, now skilled in binding wounds and staunching the flow of blood. The fighting was brutal, a desperate close-quarters struggle in the woods and rocks. Nakohi was everywhere, a blur of motion, his war cry a beacon of defiance for his people. They held the first attack, and the second. But they were desperately outnumbered. Their arrows were running low, their fighters were growing weary. In a lull in the fighting, Nakohi came to her, his face grim, a shallow cut bleeding on his cheek. "We cannot hold them much longer," he said. "Diablo is too reckless. He will sacrifice all his men to break us." "There has to be another way," Sarah said, her mind racing. "There is one," Nakohi said, his eyes turning toward the high cliffs at the back of the valley. "The place of the spirits. My people believe the Ancient Ones live there. There is a pass, high up, dangerous, but it could lead us out." "And Diablo knows this?" Nakohi nodded. "He knows. But he is a man of this world. He does not believe in the old ways. He thinks the stories are just to frighten children. He will not expect us to go there." It was a desperate gamble. The pass was treacherous, a narrow ledge with a sheer drop. To move the women, children, and wounded across it in the dark, while being pursued, seemed impossible. Just then, Thomas slipped out of the woods, his face pale. "Ma," he whispered. "I saw him. The bad man, Cain." "Where?" Sarah demanded. "He's not with the fighters," Thomas said. "He's on the far ridge, with some of his men. They're just watching." A cold realization dawned on Sarah. Cain didn't care if Diablo's men won or lost. He was just using them to soften up Nakohi's people. Once both sides were weakened and bleeding, his riflemen would move in and finish the job, taking the valley for themselves. He was playing both sides. "We have to warn Diablo," Sarah said. Nakohi stared at her as if she were mad. "He would kill the messenger." "Not if the message is one he wants to hear," she said, a desperate plan forming in her mind. "He thinks Cain is his ally. What if he learns he's being betrayed?" "He will not believe a white woman," Nakohi said. "He might believe him. Sarah said, putting her hand on Thomas's shoulder. An Apache man once told me that the land speaks to him, that he listens well. Diablo will see an Apache boy, wearing the amulet of his ancestors, speaking the truth. It was a risk beyond imagining, sending her son into the heart of a warband. But it was their only chance. The plan was set. Under the cover of the chaos of the next attack, Thomas, guided by Hawkeye, would slip through the lines. They would find Diablo and deliver the message of Cain's betrayal. Meanwhile, Nakohi would lead the rest of his people toward the high pass, the place of the spirits, creating a diversion. Sarah would go with them. As they prepared to part, Nakohi took Sarah's hands. The words he had been about to say the night before came rushing out, a torrent of emotion held back too long. "If we live, Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "I want to join my life to yours. I want Ayanna to know you as her mother, and Thomas as his father." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He pressed the small wooden bird back into her hand. "I will find you," he promised, "on the other side of the mountain." Then he was gone, leading his fighters in a feigned charge to draw the enemy's attention. Hawkeye and Thomas melted into the forest, and Sarah, her heart a tangled mess of terror and love, began the treacherous climb toward the Spirit Pass, leading the women and children to a future she couldn't see, praying she would see the men she loved again. The Spirit Pass was a nightmare of crumbling rock and howling wind. A narrow goat trail, slick with ice even in the summer, clung to the side of the mountain. One misstep meant a 1,000-foot fall into the ravine below. Sarah moved with a slow, desperate care, her hand holding tight to the hand of the child behind her, creating a human chain of survival. She could hear the sounds of the battle fading below, replaced by the roar of the wind. She didn't know if Thomas and Hawkeye had made it. She didn't know if Nakohi was still alive. All she could do was climb. They were halfway across the most dangerous section of the pass when they heard the shouts from behind. A small group of Cain's men, skilled trackers, had bypassed the main battle and followed them. They were moving fast, their heavy boots sure on the treacherous path. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped on the ledge. Sarah shoved the children and women behind her into a small alcove in the rock. She stood at the entrance, the old rifle, James's rifle, in her hands. She had only 3 bullets left. She would make them count. The first man came around the bend in the path. He saw her and grinned, raising his rifle. Sarah fired. The man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and tumbled silently into the abyss. The other 2 men took cover, firing blindly around the rock. Chips of stone exploded around her head. She waited, her heart hammering. One of them made a run for it. She fired again. He screamed and fell, clutching his leg. 1 man left, 1 bullet. He was smart. He was waiting her out. Then, she heard it. A war cry from the far side of the pass. Nakohi. He had held off the main attack and had followed them. He charged along the narrow ledge, a fearsome sight, his face painted for war. The last of Cain's men turned, startled, and Nakohi was on him, a whirlwind of righteous fury. The fight was short and brutal. It ended with a single, choked scream and another body plunging into the ravine. Nakohi reached her, his chest heaving. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. At that moment, a new sound reached them. A roar of fury from the valley below. But it wasn't directed at them. It was the sound of Apaches fighting Apaches. Thomas's message had been delivered. Diablo, enraged at Cain's betrayal, had turned his warriors against his former allies. The tide of the battle had turned. They made their way down the far side of the mountain, a weary, battered group of survivors. When they reached the bottom, they found Hawkeye and Thomas waiting for them. The boy ran into his mother's arms, sobbing with relief. "It worked, Ma," he cried. "It worked." The battle in the valley raged for another hour, a bloody settling of scores. By the time silence fell, both sides were decimated. Diablo was dead. The last of Cain's men were either dead or had fled, and Silas Cain himself was gone. They returned to the valley, not as a sanctuary, but as a graveyard. The cost of their victory had been immense. But they were alive, and they were free. A month later, as the valley began to heal, as the first signs of autumn painted the leaves of the cottonwoods, a lone rider approached. It was the cavalry lieutenant from weeks ago. But this time, his face was not hard with suspicion. It was grim with respect. Silas Kane's body was found in the mountains, he reported. Looks like he ran into some of Diablo's warriors who weren't too happy with him. Justice comes in many forms in this territory. He looked around at the signs of the battle, then at the small, growing community of settlers and Apaches working together to build new shelters. We received a report, the lieutenant said, from a man named William Reynolds. A deathbed confession of sorts. Seems he got caught in the crossfire. Told us the whole story. About Kane. About the so-called renegades. He shook his head. We were all fools. He turned to Nakohi. Your people are cleared of all charges. You are free to go. We are home, Nakohi said simply. The lieutenant looked at Sarah, at Thomas, at Ayanna, who was now a healthy, gurgling baby in Sarah's arms. He didn't seem to understand what he was seeing, but he knew it was something he had no right to question. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them in peace. That evening, as the sun set, Nakohi and Sarah stood on the ridge overlooking their valley. Thomas was below, showing Ayanna a small carved wooden bird. Nakohi took her hand. I asked you a question, he said softly, before the battle. And I gave you an answer, she replied, her heart full. He slipped a simple band of braided leather onto her finger. This is not a chain, he said, his eyes smiling. It is a promise. To build a new life. Together. She leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the valley, at their two families becoming one. They were a strange and beautiful sight, a testament to the idea that even in the most unforgiving of lands, hope, like a desert flower, could find a way to bloom. If you enjoyed this story of survival and the families we choose, don't forget to subscribe. There are always more stories waiting to be told.